On July 1st, unbeknownst to everyone at the ranch, their good buddy Charles Tex Watson was about to cost them everything. Tex approached his ex-girlfriend, Rosina Kroner, about setting up a drug deal. In his words, "I called Luella," the alias he gave Rosina, on July 1 and said that the family had $100 and wanted to buy a kilo of grass, but our mafia vending machine connection would only sell 25 kilos at a throw for a cool $2,500. Tex asked Rosina for the money, but she didn't have that much cash. But then, she called back and told me that she knew somebody who was interested in buying the extra kilos, but she needed to make some money out of the deal as well. The somebody Rosina referred to was her dealer. His name was Bernard Crow, but he was known as Lotsapoppa. Several movies have portrayed Crow as an obese black man, but his nickname had more to do with his self-proclaimed sexual prowess, not his girth. Crow, 27, played trumpet in a jazz quartet and lived in an apartment above Sunset Boulevard. He was also part of a forgery and fencing ring in Los Angeles, creating fake Social Security cards. Tex explained to Rosina that the plan was to get $2,500 from Crow, buy the drugs, and sell most of them to her clients at a $25 markup per kilo. Then he would bank the extra weed, 3 kilos worth, to Tex and the family, pass a few $100s back to Rosina, and then reimburse Crow. But Watson actually had a more nefarious scheme in mind. He told Rosina that he must meet alone with his dealer. The guy won't trust anyone else, he argued. He's got to get the money from Rosina's contact and meet privately with the dealer. Rosina called Lotsapoppa, who agreed to meet at her apartment. Tex asked TJ to drive him to Los Angeles from Spawn Ranch. TJ would drop me near Luella's apartment to make it look like I'd hitchhiked. He'd then go on to the dealer's place on the other side of town, parking in the back of the apartment house out of which the man worked. Luella would drive me back there with the money, and I'd go in the front door and out the back with the bread, leaving her to explain things to her friend. He wasn't planning to buy drugs at all. He just needed $2,500. Tex was not only planning to rob a drug dealer, but also to burn his ex-girlfriend in the process. What a prince. But Crow thought the plan seemed hinky from the start. When Watson arrived, Crow had his guard up, and he wasn't alone. 3 of his friends had accompanied him to Rosina's apartment. Tex wrote, "He and one of his boys waited downstairs in their big black caddy. I tried everything I could think of, including walking out of the door, but finally we ended up riding out to the Connections apartment in Crow's car, with his men on either side of us, just like something out of a movie." Meanwhile, TJ had driven to the dealer's place in El Monte and parked out back where he wouldn't be seen. When Tex, Rosina, Crow, and the other men pulled up, Tex was ready to spring into action. He was going to walk into the apartment complex with the cash and give the others the slip, sneaking out to where TJ was waiting for him. But Crow said, wait a minute. He could just picture this grimy Texan making off with his money, and told him he wanted a guarantee. He told Tex that if he was on the up and up, he wouldn't mind leaving Rosina with them while he went inside to score. She was his promissory note. When Crow threatened violence to her if I tried to cheat them, I gave him one of my Texas grins and drawled that they should know I'd be coming back when they had my girl. But Tex didn't give a shit about Rosina. It didn't much matter to me what they did to Luella, as long as I got the money for Charlie. They gave me the cash, and I went straight into the front of the apartment and straight out the back. TJ and I were off to the ranch. Crow and his friends waited a while before realizing what happened. They drove Rosina back to her apartment at 6933 Franklin in Hollywood Heights. Crow knew he'd been set up. He demanded Rosina tell him where that southern son of a bitch went. She said that Watson lived on an old movie ranch in Chatsworth. Crow asked Rosina if she knew the phone number. As a matter of fact, she did. At 2 a.m., she called the ranch and handed Bernard Crow the phone. Back at Spawn, Manson was having a good old time. That crazy Tex Watson had shown up with $2,500 in cash, and everyone was celebrating. Crow told the young lady who answered the phone to put Charles on the line. Crow had no idea that nobody at the ranch knew Tex by his Christian name. There was only one Charles known there, and that was Manson. Charlie came to the phone only to hear the drug dealer threatening him. Initially, Crow thought he was talking to Tex and said he was going to kill him. When Manson interjected and explained that he was a different Charles and claimed he hadn't seen Watson in weeks, Crow said he was going to show up at Spawn Ranch nonetheless, kill everyone there, and slit Charlie's throat from ear to ear. He told Manson that he had Rosina, and he'd better get down to her apartment to make good on the money stolen before he did something horrible to her, and then drove north to Spawn Ranch. Manson went into an absolute panic, not just rage, which certainly he felt at Watson, putting everyone in danger, but abject terror. He was convinced that this black drug dealer was going to come murder him. One wonders if Charlie wasn't feeling a little remorseful. You see, the idea was his to begin with. He told Tex to talk to Rosina about fronting some cash for a drug deal. Charlie's plan was to simply buy the kilos of marijuana, and then the family could sell them for a profit. When Tex told Manson that Rosina demurred, claiming she had no money, that got Charlie mad. Charlie always had this crazy notion that everyone they knew had more money than they were letting on. He probably said something along the lines of "fuck Rosina" to Watson, now that dunderheaded Texan had burned a drug dealer and put everyone's life in jeopardy. Manson had given Watson a lot of leeway that year. This was the thanks he got. Now he had to go and fix Tex's mess. He assured Crow that he was coming to Rosina's to settle the matter. He sent Tex, with Sadie, the biggest blabbermouth in the family, to the caves to camp overnight. The last thing he needed was the rest of the gang learning how close to danger they were. Then Manson had TJ drive him back to Rosina's apartment. Sadie Mae Glutz was indeed a blabbermouth. Her forked tongue did a lot of damage, including her jailhouse tattling and grand jury testimony. She also wrote 2 books in prison about the Manson family and the murders they committed. Her second book, The Myth of Helter Skelter, focused on her theory of motive. While anyone would rightly question Susan's ability to tell the truth, this author believed some of that particular story. There were consistencies to Susan's tales over the years, and that final story feels as full a truth as she was able to tell. According to The Myth of Helter Skelter, Crow told him he was a Black Panther, and he knew where Manson was, and if Manson didn't come down and give him his money, he and all his Black Panther buddies were going to make a raid at Spawn's ranch and kill everyone. Did Crow actually claim he was a Black Panther, or did Manson simply infer it? We know that Lotsapoppa was not, in fact, in the Black Panther party, but might he have told Charlie that he was, to scare Manson enough to get his white ass down to Hollywood and return that cash? It's also possible that Manson simply believed that Crow was affiliated with the Panthers. Charlie considered anyone who was black and potentially a threat to be more militant than they were. Years later, Manson admitted that he did not believe that Crow was involved with the Black Panther Party, and yet this detail was a major catalyst in the events that transpired later. We may never know how the Black Panther angle worked its way into the situation, but it had a profound and disastrous effect on what followed. Per Susan, Manson believed the only way to prevent the Panthers from getting his name and whereabouts was to eliminate the source, Bernard Crow. If something happened to Crow, no one would be around to tell the Panthers anything. And so Charles Manson told Bernard Crow he would meet with him and straighten the whole thing up. Manson got a gun, and the account given by TJ later was that Charles Manson placed the gun in the back of his pants so that it wouldn't be visible. If Manson wasn't able to talk his way out of the situation, Manson would signal TJ, who was supposed to pull out the gun and shoot Bernard Crow. Susan went on to explain that when Manson got to Bernard Crow's apartment, there were several of his friends there. Here's the thing. Susan did know more than others about that night, but she mistakenly thinks Crow and his friends are Black Panthers. Not only are none of these men affiliated with the Black Panther Party, but the 3 friends of Crow's are actually white men, and one was buddies with Dennis Wilson. Dale Fimple, Steve Scorpy, and Brian Lukashevsky are the 3 men with Crow at Rosina Kroner's apartment and who accompanied Crow and Tex to the dealer's place in El Monte. In fact, when Watson and TJ arrived at the Franklin residence late that night, Crow wasn't even there. He'd stepped out, leaving Rosina with the other 3. Dale Fimple was from Sonoma, California, and died the following fall in a car crash. Steve Scorpy is a mystery. According to Crow's later trial testimony, Scorpy lived in Brooklyn, but his name turns up nothing now. Brian or Bryn Lukashevsky was a good friend of Wilson's. He was known as a Hollywood hanger-on, a club kid. It's easy to construe a connection, therefore, between Crow and Wilson, but Lukashevsky was known as a sycophant in the Hollywood scene. Likely Crow is just a guy he buys weed from, but also possible was that Brian was there to score for his friend Wilson. Was Crow dealing to the drummer and his friends? Was there a prior connection between Charles Manson and Lotsapoppa? Years ago, someone claimed that Diane Lake allegedly referred to Crow as the black member of the family, but there's no verification of this statement, and Lake made no mention of it in her recent tell-all. While waiting for Crow, Charlie made small talk with the other men. He even admired the silk shirt Lukashevsky wore. In a few minutes, Crow re-entered the apartment, and he and Charlie were talking calmly. Charlie told him to the effect that you can't take my friend's life, you must take my life. When Crow said that no, he didn't want to harm Charlie, just the people that had burned him, Charlie had him where he wanted him. Charlie performed some sort of ritualistic dance and then got ready to leave. But Crow demanded the return of his money. He was not willing to work out some deal and was annoyed with Charlie's antics. So that meant that Manson needed TJ to take action, as previously planned. However, TJ's better sense prevailed, Atkins explained, and he refused to pull the gun out of the back of Manson's pants. This left Manson standing all alone, facing several Black Panthers. Again, not being present, Susan believed that Crow and his friends were actually militants, not drug dealers and wannabes. And one angry dope dealer who'd just been ripped off. Manson was forced to pull the gun himself. He shot Bernard Crow right in the chest. Crow fell to the ground and lay still. Manson and TJ ran. Charlie actually fired the gun twice. The gun misfired on the first attempt, but on the second fire, he hit Lotsapoppa. The .22 revolver he used was the same one that Tex used weeks later at Cielo Drive, and allegedly the previous April to rob drug dealer Joel Rostow. Before bolting, Manson asked Lukashevsky if he could have that silk shirt. As you may imagine, Brian was happy to remove it and hand the shirt over. Susan argued that Charles Manson ended up having to pull the gun and shoot Crow himself is a testament to how foolish a position he'd put himself in. He had obviously thought he could get TJ to take care of his dirty work for him. That it hadn't worked, and he'd had to dirty his hands, infuriated Charles Manson. Not only did the Panthers believe it was he who had ripped off Crow, they would soon find out it was he who had killed one of their brothers. When Charles Manson returned to Spawn's ranch that night, he still had to worry about where he was going to raise money for more drugs, and where he was going to make his connections, and whether the police were getting ready to move in on him over the auto thefts and underage kids at the ranch. On top of all that, he now had to worry about a murder charge and the prospect of being arrested. More disturbing to him that night was the prospect of retaliation by the Panthers for Crow's death. She also wrote, he was so angry and abusive to TJ when they got back to Spawn's ranch that TJ left in the middle of the night out of fear for his life. Now, questions have come up in recent years about Crow and poor kidnapping victim Rosina Luella Kroner. Just what was her role in the events of July 1st? It seems clear now that she and Lotsapoppa had an arrangement ahead of the theft and shooting, one that indicates that she was no damsel in distress. After all, when Crow was shot and lying on the floor, Rosina did not flee the scene. she stayed behind. What Manson didn't know was that he did not kill Bernard Crowe. Crowe's friends rushed him to the hospital where he remained for 2 weeks. He wasn't a Black Panther, so the Panthers weren't planning retaliation. But the next morning, a news report allegedly surfaced of a Black Panther being shot to death and left on the lawn of UCLA Hospital, and Manson heard that news. He went absolutely apeshit insane. He believed he killed a Black Panther, and now the Panthers were coming for him, his family, and everyone at Spawn Ranch. At least, that's the story told for years. Even though Crowe survived his wounds, the Panthers weren't lying in wait for Charlie, and he wasn't facing a murder rap. The Crowe incident was the inciting event that led to the murders in Topanga Canyon, Bel Air, and Los Feliz. The motive begins here, even though Crowe didn't die at Charlie's hand. It was Manson's idea to have Tex get money from Rosina, and when that plan backfired, led to the theft of $2,500 from Bernard Crowe, which prompted Manson to shoot the man, which resulted in 2 major things. 1, Manson urgently needed to get out of town, which meant he needed even more money. And 2, Manson was super pissed at Tex Watson. It must have been obvious to Charles Manson if he wanted to live, he had to get away from Spawn's ranch, wrote Susan. If Bernard Crowe had found him there, then anyone could find him there. But moving takes money. The whole reason the family had ended up in the old, dilapidated, fly-ridden movie ranch was because money was scarce. This plan for killing Crowe gives a perfect insight into Charles Manson. If the dealer threatened him, he'd get an innocent person to take the fall for killing Crowe. TJ was a member of the very family that Manson professed a willingness to die for, one of our brotherhood, as he used to put it, a friend. Manson didn't kill anyone, but he did destroy his relationship with 3 powerful men the night he shot Crowe. Lukashevsky called Dennis Wilson. Greg Jacobson overheard that call and told Terry Melcher. In a 1970 article in Rolling Stone, Jacobson recalled, "That crazy guy Charlie, he shot some spade in the stomach, bent over, kissed his feet, and said, 'I love you, brother.' That sounds like Charlie all right." Still desperate for money, Charlie tried to reach Dennis. He didn't know why Wilson wasn't returning his calls, so he went to see Dennis's agent. He wanted to collect money for his songwriting work with the Beach Boys, but also to do damage control. After bamboozling his way past the agent's receptionist, the agent blew up at Charlie. He informed him that they didn't owe him a damn thing because they had no contract with him. The man then ordered Charlie out of his office, intimating he would send a hitman after him. Spitefully, Manson then left a single bullet at Dennis's house, a warning that Charlie knew Wilson had turned on him. And that's when Manson and several women went to Melcher's beach house, where they stole an expensive telescope from his porch. Like the bullet left at Wilson's, it was Charlie's calling card. But Manson wasn't plotting to kill Melcher following the Crowe shooting. He was too busy looking over his shoulder. He believed he was in danger. Charlie wanted to flee that very moment. But he didn't. That's because he couldn't afford to run and hide, believing perhaps that he'd killed a Black Panther, and the rest of the Panthers were gonna come murder his cracker ass. Charlie may also have realized a more deeply fearful scenario than Black Panthers. Bernard Crowe was connected to organized crime figures in Los Angeles, and quite likely that $2,500 he lent to Watson was a loan from them. Were Charlie and the family targeted by the mob, and did he know that? Manson needed to stay at Spawn Ranch, the only place he could control, and mobilize the others for his defense. He needed to fortify his army before he could lead them into the desert. To build that army, he needed provisions, more guns, more dune buggies, more food, more supplies, more cash, and more drugs. Manson desperately needed the muscle and might of the straight Satans. By July 2nd, following the shooting of Lotsapoppa, nothing was more important than keeping the bikers happy so they would continue to serve Charlie's needs. Danny DiCarlo found the buntline special in the gunroom for him to clean. Suspecting the weapon was dirty, he was reluctant to get his own prints on it. Manson hid his paranoia from his followers in the wake of Crow's shooting. In fact, he acted cavalier when anyone was looking. He even bragged to some of the men that he plugged a blackie, but he was terrified nonetheless. A week after shooting Lotsapoppa, more than 24 black people arrived at Spawn Ranch to ride the ponies. Manson was convinced they were Panthers, checking the place out to report back to their leadership. Geez, for a man as nonchalant about death as Charlie, that dude sure was scared to die. Days after the Black Riders came, Shorty Shea showed up at Spawn's with his new bride. Shorty had married Magdalene Stokes, a black barmaid and stripper, in Vegas the night Manson shot Crow. Charlie hated Shea. Steve Grogan remembered that Charlie didn't like him because he was always drinking and he thought he was a slob. He was always talking about messing with the girls. It was kind of subtle at first, the way he voiced his dislike and disapproval of the man. Shorty was excited to show off his bride. Manson was shocked that Shea had the audacity to bring a blackie to Spawn Ranch, and other family members were just as unfriendly. According to Ruby Pearl, he brought her to the ranch, and it made the hippies mad. Gypsy and Sue told everyone in the Manson family not to sit in the same chair that Shorty's wife had sat in after she left. Susan Bartell, aka Country Sue, was an 18-year-old from the Valley. Sue later made a name for herself during the trials, calling and threatening witnesses. With these black interlopers daring to show their faces at Spawn Ranch, Charlie grew more paranoid. Susan Atkins wrote, "Believing he had murdered Bernard Crow, Charles Manson became frantic. He came up with a plan to protect himself. He could hardly admit he had just killed a Black Panther and the entire Brotherhood of Black Panthers was about to come screaming into Spawn's ranch to wipe them all out. Everyone would have left. Manson had to figure out how to turn Spawn's ranch into a fortress without letting anyone know what the real reason was. And then it came to him. The answer was right before his eyes. The answer was Helter Skelter, the apocalyptic race war. Manson no longer believed the doomsday theory he'd first imagined 7 months before, but if he could use it to corral the others, that was perfectly fine. Charles Manson's Helter Skelter story really drew the family together. If facing an onslaught of Black Panthers, the best defense would be to scatter. But if preparing for Armageddon, there would be no use in running away. Patricia confirmed, "We started to have a lot more guns at the ranch and knives, and people were on lookouts. We were pretty much all running on definite fear, and he asked us constantly, 'Will you die for me?' I totally believed Charlie," Gypsy concurred. "I believed that the cities were going to burn. I believed my only safety was to stay with the family." But Manson's message to the men was different than the doomsday missives he gave the women. Per Susan, none of these odd stories is what he told the male followers who were close to him and who shared his confidence during the drug dealing. I think the most decisive blow to the contention that Helter Skelter was the true motive for the killings was the fact Charles Manson told these men he had just killed a panther and he needed money to split to the desert and he needed it now. The reason I know this is because my son was over half a year old and I was becoming very attached to him. This was not allowed by Charles Manson. Mothers were kept away from their own children under the pretense that parents put too much guilt and structure on children and that they should be allowed to grow up free. In truth, it was an ironclad way of ensuring the mother would do whatever Charles Manson told her to do. I became so persistent about seeing my son and trying to look after him that I was constantly being sent away from Spawn's ranch with the men when they went to take care of business. This not only meant that I overheard things the other women didn't get a chance to, I was able to see how the explanations Charles Manson gave for what we were doing varied depending on who he was talking to. Specifically, I got to hear what he told the men, and he didn't waste their time with stories of Helter Skelter. Manson told the story of Helter Skelter to the women, and he told the truth to his right-hand men. Barbara Hoyt claimed that Sadie never visited her little boy, but perhaps she was simply prevented from doing so. Then again, Susan was a pathological liar. Within a week of Crow's shooting, Charlie told several men the same cryptic message he previously told Paul Watkins. They might need to launch Helter Skelter themselves.